I want to draw an analogy here, and I'm not an historian. I'm a philologist, right? So I use history to understand ancient texts. I think you use text to understand history. So it's a bit, we're kind of opposite of what we do. In around roughly the same time, because you called it an insurrection, that's really interesting. Roughly around the same time, within a few decades, in China, you have something called the Taiping Rebellion. And it's founded by this person who has a revelation, just like Joseph Smith, except in his revelation, he finds out he's the brother of Jesus. He rebels against the Qing emperor, and he establishes what is essentially an empire in central southern China that lasts for over 10 years. And so he does what I think you suspect Joseph Smith wanted to do, is he creates a religious empire.
Yeah.
And it takes foreign powers from Europe to defeat him. The Qing can't defeat him. They bring in Chinese Gordon, who is a general who was eventually killed at Khartoum. There's an international force, General Cho from General Cho's Chicken, who is from Changsha, or a suburb of Changsha, where I lived for a year. He was the Chinese general who led the Chinese forces, but by himself they couldn't defeat the Taiping. Was called the Heavenly Kingdom. That could have happened in the United States. We could have had, and I think I've heard you say, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that was one of his objectives, was to create a theocracy in the western part of the United States, in the Mississippi Valley, and that could have happened if history had gone slightly differently. So talk about that. That's unbelievable. Like we don't, like today, I don't know. Here's my impression of Mormons as a non-Mormon. Like we even make jokes, right? We make jokes that at the airport when they're, frisking the Muslim in the hijab, like, well, they're not doing that to Mormons, right? Because the Mormons are these docile, friendly people. That's not your experience because you grew up Mormon, right? And you know the history. But I think that's the impression of the average American is, we have no security concerns for Mormons. But history could have gone way different. I want you to talk about that for a little bit.
Well, there is a militant strain in Mormonism. It's in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is a revolutionary document. It predicts the founding of a theocracy, the New Jerusalem, what I call the New Jerusalem government, in the wilderness of America. But this wasn't a foreign idea. I mean, you had the Burr conspiracy, Aaron Burr.
So tell us what the Burr conspiracy is.
Alexander Hamilton in a duel.
Right.
Well, he was trying to start a Western coup, what they call a Western coup, a government independent of the United States,
Really?
Yeah, it never came to fruition. And
all right, we got to stop here a second. Who's Aaron Burr and what was this Burr conspiracy? You can't just gloss over that.
Okay, so this is around. He was running for president and failed at that attempt, but it's Jefferson's revolution of 1800. That Aaron Burr was trying to formulate a coup in a Western empire in the uncharted territories of the United States, basically. And in the early days, it was believed that, or accused, Andrew Jackson was accused of conspiring with Aaron Burr, but
really
not so sure about that. But
and at this point, Western means what? Across the Appalachian Mountains, or where's Western at this point?
Yeah, okay. In Indian Territory, past the Mississippi.
Oh, okay. Across the Mississippi.
Before the Indians were driven there.
Okay. This is before the Trail of Tears and but there's still Indians or Native Americans across the Mississippi, just not the tribes that later were expelled to there. Okay. So across the Mississippi.
It was a short-lived kind of adventure, you might call it, that totally failed. It didn't go anywhere. They used the Royal Arch cipher, it is said, to write messages dealing with this conspiracy to establish a government in America, United States territorial areas. But
okay, so there's precedent for a rival
government
in the West. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. Okay.
So Joseph Smith, though, according to the Book of Mormon and prophecies, these are prophecies that he was trying to fulfill, was going to establish a New Jerusalem government with Native Americans. That would be mostly their government with the aid of believing Gentiles and non Israelites, put it that way.
So believing Gentiles is another
Israelites. So
believing Gentiles is another way of saying white Mormons. Is that okay? So all right. So I think this brings us back to a bigger question, which is, why did Joseph Smith write the Book of Mormon?
That's why. A lot of people don't know that nowadays. They all see that as prophecy in the future. It's a very nebulous idea. When Jesus comes again, maybe when the world has changed anyway. They don't realize that Joseph Smith was trying to do it.
So you believe he wrote, one of the reasons he wrote the Book of Mormon was in order to lay the foundation for this theocracy in the western part of what at the time was the U.S.
Well, he had no location.
Oh, okay. Somewhere he wanted, this would give him authority to rule this theocracy, basically, is your contention. Yes. Okay.
To be the prophet of this theocracy that would have a perfect community. They would be one in love and heart. Their hearts would be knit together, and they will have this perfect utopian society. Not unlike Quakers, Shakers. The Oneida Commune is another secular kind of experiment in communalism. And so Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, it was all about communalism. It was all about the ideal of that Acts passage where it talks about the early Christians had all things in common.
That's really interesting, because the Taiping rebels focused on those verses as well in Acts.
Yeah.
And then later Mao sort of retconned the Taiping rebellion as an early workers' revolt and as a proto form of communism, right? Because actually, I think it was before Marx, or at least before his publication of the Communist Manifesto, at least the initial Taiping. I could be wrong about that. But the initial Heavenly Kingdom, I think, it certainly didn't, even if Marx had written his works at that point, they wouldn't have been aware of it in, South Central China at that point. But they experimented in some form of communal pooling of property, which early Mormons did as well. And I find that was really surprising. Like, this was, this is what some of the things that got them in trouble was experimenting with, just redistribution of wealth, and it failed essentially from an economic perspective. Right, that was the whole bank in Ohio that failed, because they're trying to print money and then give it to people, and they have no way to back it up.
The bank was a different kind of thing, but it failed. But before Joseph Smith even arrived in northern Ohio, in that Geauga County, there were already Christians practicing a form of communalism. They were kind of a group associated with Alexander Campbell's Church of Christ, or Disciples of Christ. They were called the family, Morley family, and Joseph Smith tried to correct or change the way they did things in this communal group. But it was essentially, he established a bishop Edward Partridge, who was a former Carmelite, and Sidney Rigdon, who was also a former Carmelite, who had been a bishop in the Campbellite group, but the bishop just meant leader of a congregation to them. Here, Joseph Smith changed bishop to have authority over worldly affairs, like economic and land and things like that. And the plan was that when you join this and you gave everything up to Jesus, and which is you gave the bishop all your property, and then he decided what you needed and gave it that portion back, and he would save the other portion for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the plan to begin with.
So do you think this has something to do with Joseph Smith growing up in like abject poverty, that he has this ideal, well, nobody should have to have that poverty. We should, some people have too much, and so we should share it with the people who don't have. Do you think that has anything to do with it?
Yeah, it has to do somewhat with that he thought these religious people that didn't share enough with the poor were hypocrites, basically. And he said, if you're not equal in wealth, you're not equal, in the kingdom of God, kind of in heaven. So he demanded, it's a high demand religion from the start, giving up your all. And eventually it doesn't work, and they replace it with tithing, a 10% of your.
So you're saying the Mormons today are getting off easy with 10% compared to what it was in the early days?
No, it's harder now.
How so?
It used in the beginning, the 10% was just of your increase, of your interest for that year. Not on everything, of the interest.
Okay.
So it wasn't like a 10% of your gross income,
Yeah, but in the Kirtland days, it was 100%, and then you get back what the bishop thinks you need.
Well, yeah, it's a lesser law. It was the lesser law.
Well, now, I don't know what that means. The lesser law.
Lesser law meaning easier. It was the easier law. The tithing it was an Old Testament practice.
For sure, right.
And that was a lot easier than the law of consecration. The law of consecration was where you consecrate everything.
Right. So compared to the Kirtland days, they're getting off easy is the point.
Yeah.